Okay, I'll quickly acknowledge my co-authors and move on. I'll point out here that my route into this work has been very much from the side of tsunami hazard assessment, and landslides are a very important part of that in our world. And I guess saying that is another way of apologizing for the primitive nature of any of the geology that will show up in this talk. Landslides are thought to be important for a wide range of scale of events, running from continental shelf failures such as the Currituck slide on the East Coast, and then down to much larger scale and much more frequent occurrences such as either submarine or subaerial or combinations of the two events in fjords and other steep-walled systems. For example, the picture at the bottom shows a simulation, which I grabbed from somewhere else because their pictures were prettier than mine, of a event in the Kinematic, British Columbia area in 1975, which generated about an 8-meter wave. Our goal in the work that's being done here is to, first of all, develop models of deformable tsunami-genic submarine and subaerial mass failures with enough physical validity to actually have some ability to generate events of the correct size. But we're also beginning to be more interested in looking at these events in terms of their depositional patterns and alteration of the seafloor over time. The development of the model is important. We need to implement these models in hydrodynamic codes because we are primarily interested in the tsunami aspects of the problem. And then there's an ongoing need for, essentially more and more representative laboratory experimentation to validate these things. And I think the previous talk was really, really nice in that regard. The modeling choices that we're faced with here, we're essentially looking at a water layer overlying a mobile sediment layer. Our sort of baseline starting point for the modeling of the water layer is the assumption that we have to model dispersive wave behavior, and I'll point out why that is in a second. But the available types of techniques for doing that range from Boussinesq models, which are very well established as surface wave models for dispersive wave motion. Other routes to that, such as the shallow water equations with pressure corrections, such as show up in the NeoWave model, which is essentially another way of doing the same thing that Boussinesq modeling does. 3D non-hydrostatic models, which I'm going to, is the approach I'm going to talk about here, which can be thought of as being essentially a subset of full 3D Navier-Stokes that achieve a lot of efficiency by making some very crucial simplifications in the formulation. As far as the slide layer goes, historically we started off with what I'll call solid slides, and that could be even as primitive as just an imposed bottom motion, or if it's actually modeled as a solid slide, you may actually just be solving the force balance for an object moving on the bottom. At the opposite extreme for that, I've done some work with 3D multiphase formulations with variable rheology, and that can lead to very computationally expensive situations. And so what we're trying to do now is back up a little bit from that and treat the water column as with that dispersive type of model, but go back to having essentially a well-identified depth-integrated slide moving on the bottom, either subaerially or underneath the water column. And that's what I'm going to concentrate on here today. For the modelers in the audience, if there are any, our treatment of the water layer is done using a model we've developed in-house called NH-Wave, which is essentially a solution either for the Euler equations if you're neglecting fluid stresses, or for the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations if you're including them. The model is essentially formulated in terrain and surface following sigma coordinates, And it's that sigma coordinate transformation together with the assumption of single-valued surface and bottom functions that leads to the overall simplification relative to a Navier-Stokes solver, because you don't have to do the really complicated surface reconstructions and things of that nature. The models are all formulated in as much as possible in conservative forms, and the solution techniques are usually using finite volume TVD schemes with fairly typical Riemann solvers and things of that nature. It's an example of the slide geometry, and I had this in here just to really point out the importance of dispersion in the problem. This is a very clean experiment done by Enet and Grilli back in 2007, where they essentially have this aluminum flying saucer sliding down a plane slope and generating a resulting wave field here, which is measured at 3 different locations in the flume. And what I have here is a solid line representing the full wave, the dispersive wave solution, the dashed line representing measurements from the laboratory, and of course the main point there is that they agree fairly well. But then the additional line in here, the dashed dot line, which forms a single negative peak here, is the solution of a corresponding non-dispersive or hydrostatic model. And this is just really to point out that the hydrostatic models that have typically historically been used as coupled with a lower layer slide motion really aren't adequate to do these problems. And so that's an important take home from that slide right there. This is essentially just a picture of that same event evolving spatially, and you can also see that as the non-hydrostatic or dispersive solution evolves, it's also more able to diffract to the sides and evolve in a more two-dimensional pattern spatially. So the hydrostatic and the non-hydrostatic simulations are very, very different, even though we tend to think of tsunami motions as occurring basically in fairly shallow water. As we moved along in this problem, we moved to a very opposite extreme and moved into the area of trying to do much more complicated two-phase mixture models, and they can get fairly complicated. In particular, we have to solve equations for the sediment distribution or whatever represents the solid phase of the motion, and that can also involve adjustable rheology in the fluid phase as well, and it also involves turbulence modeling, and typically at the scales we're working at, that's been done in terms of K-epsilon modeling. An example of that, just sort of validating the concept, here's a model of gravity current evolving over a plane slope. Data from Marcelo Garcia back in '93, and plots of velocities normalized by a characteristic value, and also vertical sediment concentration distributions, with the solid line representing model results and the circles representing lab data. Here's a corresponding simulation of a gravity current event and a corresponding tsunami-genic deformation of the surface. That's just in there essentially as a cartoon to show that the concept works, but these calculations become very expensive to do computationally, and we just really didn't want to do it that way anymore. And so what we've been doing more recently is going back to the notion of using a much simpler representation of the slide motion in terms of a depth integrated slide layer. There's a long history of doing this, usually in conjunction with coupling to non-dispersive tsunami models. In particular, viscous fluid models have been used quite a while by a number of authors, as well as Bingham plastic models that attempt to represent mud behavior better. We've been working a lot lately on partially subaerial or completely subaerial slides, and that has driven us more to look at debris flow models, which is where I'm going to show illustrations of today. A typical model that's available is for avalanche, corresponding avalanche dynamics is a model by Iverson and Denlinger, which is really an elaboration of the Savage and Hutter granular flow model. That essentially represents what the abstract said, and it sort of represents where I've gotten to at this point, but our real goal is to go, for the subaerial case, to a much more evolved two-phase debris flow model that will account for dilatancy and pore pressure feedback. It's a model recently published by Iverson and George as an example of that. And of course, if we were doing purely submarine mud flow slides, then being able to do stuff like what was in the previous talk would be really nice too. Putting these models together, you have a choice of coordinates, and this comes out very much from the landslide literature or avalanche literature. You can put your model together in purely horizontal Cartesian coordinates. This makes it very easy to match the slide model to the hydrodynamic model lying on top of it. If you're using a granular flow model, such as a Coulomb-based stress model, it makes specification of the stress state much harder. Because your reference plane isn't parallel to your base. You also need to introduce special treatments for vertical accelerations to make the model essentially correctly dispersive or responsive to vertical acceleration. On the other hand, if you're working in slope-oriented coordinates, the stress tensors are simple, vertical accelerations are taken care of automatically. And it becomes terribly difficult to map the problem onto arbitrary two-dimensional bathymetry or topography. So our preference in the long run is to stick with the horizontal coordinate system used in the hydrodynamic code, but because of their simplicity, the formulations or the results I'm going to show today are based on slope-oriented coordinates over a simple geometry. The model equations, again, these are formulated using the Coulomb friction theory and essentially the simplifications that are described in Iverson and Denlinger, and I'm not going to go too much into that. I'll point out that the free parameters in the problem are essentially the internal and the bed friction angles, which we specify for given tests according to values that are reported for the papers describing the tests. And then the other parameter in here is this lambda, and this essentially represents the portion of the vertical load of the slide on the substrate that's being carried by the pore pressure in the fluid. So if lambda is large, the slide is more mobilized and is being supported more by the pore pressure distribution. If lambda is small, then it's being supported more by grain contact and direct contact with the bottom. And that's going to be the free parameter that I look at sensitivity for, and I'll go through this very quickly. Again, it's very typical avalanche model with the difference that we have an applied pressure gradient from the fluid layer over top, as well as tangential or drag bottom stresses, top stresses in this case, induced by the fluid layer as well. And then the solutions, again, are by typical finite volume TVD schemes. A couple of quick test cases just to get done here. It's a 1D simulation. This is very much in the very popular test category of filling a bin full of gravel and then firing it at high velocity into the water column to see what you get. A tank set up here with wave gauges distributed offshore, just a schematic of the initial slide motion. Our own simulations are based on putting this slide motion on the slope with the given velocity that it's fired out of the apparatus with. And these produce very, very complicated behavior in the near field. In particular, the fluid layer is usually lifted completely off the bottom, forming this impact cavity here. Our model can't do that because the bottom follows the terrain by definition. And so the question then becomes how does that affect the results in the far field? And the question is the answer is you still get fairly good results. So this is a comparison of measured data against simulations with two different values of lambda. Model continues to work pretty well. And that's essentially where we are in terms of modeling this. One typical problem that we have is that our run-out distances tend to be a little bit too long, and we think that's due to the rheological formulation and something that we need to work on more in the future. And the rest of my slides were just a different test case that did basically the same thing, so I'll stop.